Okay, you ready to go? Good morning. Welcome, those of you that were here yesterday, welcome back, and welcome to anyone who just arrived this morning for the conference. We're going to have, I think, a great panel of speakers today throughout the morning, culminating with the governor coming to do the closeout for us. First, I would like to introduce Talina Matthews, who is one of our Public Service Commission commissioners, and was, at the time we organized this conference, was the executive director of the Public Service Commission, is going to be introducing our first speaker. And then Aaron Keatley, who is our commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, is going to introduce our second speaker. After that, we'll have a break, and then Aaron's going to come back, and we're going to have a panel discussion on environmental issues. So, Talina.
Okay, success. I didn't fall coming up the steps. We can see if I continued to not fall. And I'm very efficient. I didn't print it off. I'm just going to read it. It is my pleasure to welcome our next speaker, and we should appreciate him a lot. He's not sure what time zone it is. He came from California last night, got here at midnight, so we need to keep him entertained after he speaks so that we don't lose him. So I have plans. He's going to see some Kentucky hospitality later this afternoon. Travis Kavulla is an elected member of the Montana Public Service Commission and has served in his current role since 2011. Commissioner Kavulla has previously been the president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, affectionately known as NARUC, fun group, just saying, and continues to serve on the association's board of directors and executive committee. As utility commissioner, Commissioner Kavulla has made decisions on hundreds and worked on several major initiatives, including the review of utility rates for several electric, natural gas, and water utilities. Prior to his election at the Public Service Commission, Commissioner Kavulla worked as a journalist and was an associate editor at the National Review. He received his bachelor's in history at Harvard University and holds a graduate degree from the University of Cambridge in England, where he was a Gates Scholar. He is a fourth-generation Montanan. So please welcome Travis.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here, especially because I just came from California, which, if you've ever not seen a place with 30 cents per kilowatt hour electricity rates and a desire to push them higher still, California's the place for you. So as a utility regulator, you kind of watch what's going on there, and with a combination of disbelief and I guess admiration in a way. I mean, they seem to know what they're doing, and they're pushing forward in their own way. But I'm going to talk to you about something really kind of different, trying to situate energy policy in some ways as a function of how utilities make money and are regulated. And in order to do that today, I want to start off with everyone's favorite topic, the Clean Power Plan. Probably everyone in this room has spent more of their lives than they really needed to paying attention to the Clean Power Plan. I know I have, I was joking out in the hallway, about half a filing cabinet full of documentation about it. And I feel as though at this present moment I have like a little bit of Stockholm syndrome. It's like, can I leave the room now? Can I exit the box? It's a great thing that Administrator Pruitt has announced the proposed repeal of this regulation for any number of reasons. And although my presentation isn't really about the Clean Power Plan today, I thought it was an appropriate place to start at because it offers a good example of a phenomenon that I want to talk about a little bit more. So, as you all know, a lot of people have pointed out that the Clean Power Plan really wouldn't have done a lot bottom line to reduce emissions in the country. That's half true, half not. It's obvious that by the basis of national emissions targets, the United States is already achieving through market mechanisms and everything else the kind of reductions that the Clean Power Plan had on offer. But there was a big problem within the states. States like Montana, states like Kentucky really would have had to retire prematurely a lot of power plants and build a lot more power plants to backfill it in order to achieve compliance with the Clean Power Plan. And in some ways, even that's kind of missing the point, because the Clean Power Plan in some ways was never about carbon emissions policy. It was really almost a political battle of who would control the big decisions on energy policy in any given state. And what made it so threatening, in my own opinion, is that EPA went well outside the fence on this particular rule. Usually when the EPA issues an environmental regulation under the Clean Air Act, they identify a certain control technology. Depending on the type of rule, it can be the most appropriate control technology for existing facilities or a best available control technology for newly built plants. And the EPA says, this is the scrubber you need to have. This is the fluoridation system for water regulation that's required of you. And for a particular facility, you need to install that pursuant to this regulation. Here, the EPA, in its carbon rule, basically said, how do you regulate carbon emissions coming off a coal plant? Well, there's relatively few technologies that are commercially available that can do that. You can try to improve heat rate. You can try to burn coal more efficiently. EPA decided to go well beyond that and basically proposed a rule saying, hey, if you build a lot of shiny new things, if you build a wind farm over here, a new gas plant over there, the production of those facilities will naturally drive coal generation out of the market. And that's what I mean about sort of beyond the fence. And if you're looking for a core criticism to bring to the door of a regulation like the Clean Power Plan, that really is it. The idea that EPA was reaching in and essentially doing industrial policy to reconfigure the entire way that the grid was built up. It was and using an obscure provision of the Federal Clean Air Act to do that. Obviously, the law was never, ever intended for that purpose. So keep in mind that the core of the Clean Power Plan is about spending a lot of capital to build shiny new things and retire older, mostly depreciated things, because that's the important thing I'm going to get to in a moment for the purposes of our conversation today. So people lined up in droves to oppose this particular regulation. If you were going to look at the petition that was submitted to the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, which is where the litigation really began in earnest, you had hundreds of litigants. Anyone who's ever looked at a court filing knows that there's this thing called the caption, which was on the previous slide. It states the name of the case, and then following that, you have a long list of the petitioners and the respondents and the appellees and the cross-appellants, and the only one who ever wins off these things are the lawyers, right? The Clean Power Plan was great for them. And if you were going to read Clean Power Plan litigation at the DC Circuit, literally the first 14 pages of any given filing was dedicated to just restating the names of all of the groups that were petitioning to either overturn or defend the rule. So you had states, you had the coal mining industry and the other extractive resource industries, you had chambers of commerce, you had think tanks, you had rural economic development associations, you had activist groups on the other side, you had consumer organizations, the whole 9 yards. Dozens of consumer-owned electric utilities, public power cooperatives, and rural electric cooperatives got involved in the filing. But curiously, there was one particular sector that actually wasn't as well represented as you think it might be. The actual sector that was most impacted by the regulation, the electric utilities that generate electric power using this or that fuel. Only 7 investor-owned utilities were sort of bold enough to actually put their name on that litigation. And a credit to Kentucky Utilities, which was among them. The utilities that I regulate were too. I think probably in Montana and Kentucky, they might have been shown the door if they didn't. But the fact remains, across the entire country, a country that has hundreds of operating subsidiaries and dozens of holding companies, only 7 investor-owned utilities challenged a rule that would have subjected them to what, by any measure, was a huge regulatory burden. Why is that? It's kind of weird, isn't it? Well, to understand why that is, and here I'm getting to the kind of core theme of my presentation, we need to understand how utilities make their money and why they wouldn't get involved in this. And to understand why they weren't involved in this particular EPA regulation that would force them to spend a lot of money to retire older assets and to build new ones, you need to understand the core principle of utility regulation, which is spend more, make more. It's actually pretty simple when you come right down to it. There's a lot of spreadsheets involved. I mean, I'm sure Talina and Mike could tell you about the voluminous filings that roll into our office. But at the end of the day, if you invest capital, you make an additional profit in the utility regulatory industry. And wow, I'm even going to bore you with an equation that demonstrates this very thing this morning. I hope all of you are operating on more sleep than I am. So this is the basic formula in utility regulation that governs how utilities get to make money. And if you look at the figure that says RR, that means the revenue requirement of a utility. When a utility files a rate case to a public service commission, the revenue requirement is the total sum of money which the rates that a regulator authorizes is designed to allow them to recover. It's the sum of their operating expenses like labor, postage, that type of thing, depreciation, which reflects the return of their capital investment over a period of time, the depreciation lifespan, and then it's a return, a rate of return, usually in the United States, 9 to 10% return on shareholder investment, plus some debt that gets included in there as well, multiplied by rate base. And rate base is just the total sum of money they've invested in capital projects over the scope of time, less depreciation. So just think about what this equation does in terms of the financial incentives of the firms that a person like me and people like your public service commissioners, think of the incentives they set up for regulated firms. If I invest more in labor, if I pay people more to work for me, ultimately it ends up being to some degree a zero-sum game. I come in and I file a rate case and I get those expenses back dollar for dollar in the revenue requirement. I can save a little money over time if I don't file another rate case and I cut employee expenses, that windfall goes back to me. But ultimately, as you see from the equation, the only thing you actually get paid a return on, the only thing you actually profit from is making capital investments, building power plants, building up the poles and wires that make up the grid. That's what it all comes down to. And how do I make more of a profit per this equation? I put more money in RB, in rate base. The more capital I invest in my system, the more profit I earn, which makes sense. There's a cost of capital to capital investments. People demand a return for parking their money somewhere. It makes sense that we pay a return on capital. But there's a curious thing in utility regulation, which is that the investor-owned utility business makes the greatest profit off of a plant the first year it's in operation. After that, it starts depreciating, and that figure RB begins diminishing. And when you apply little r, the rate of return, to a smaller figure in RB, you make less of a profit, right? Now, compare that to your own business experience, if you've ever been in business. Most businesses lose money, right, on expensive new assets in the first year of ownership, only to grow their earnings in the outer years as the asset's financing is repaid. The utility industry is basically the exact opposite of that. They make the most money the first year something is capitalized in rates. And a famous economist, Milton Friedman, once joked, it's the only business where you make a profit from redecorating the CEO's office. So if you ever visit the CEO's office of a regulated utility that's investor-owned, and then pay another visit, as I often do, to the offices, say, of a rural electric cooperative, you'll notice that the furnishings are often different between those two establishments. But the fact remains, regardless of whether it's a power plant or office furniture or whatever, there is a capital investment incentive in the regulation of investor-owned utilities. This is a problem. It Some people, including me, can argue that it sort of needs to be this way because you need to pay a return on capital investment. But I think we can't be blind to the fact that this leads to some perverse incentives on the part of the business we're regulating. And these are some of them, and I just want to walk through them one by one briefly. First, as should be, I think, clear, there's a hostility to assets that are still productive but fully depreciated. If I put into the ground a coal plant in the 1960s or the 1970s and it had a 40-year depreciation lifespan, what return, what profit, if I'm an investor-owned utility, am I now making in 2017 on that power plant? Anyone? Goose egg. You're not making a profit. The plant is fully depreciated, your capital has been returned to you by your utility ratepayers, and you're not earning a margin on your remaining investment in that plant unless you've had to make more subsequent capital reinvestments in that power plant. That often happens, but it's minimal frequently compared to the cost of a new build plant. Fully depreciated assets ultimately don't pay you anything, and it's not really fun to just be operating a facility that doesn't pay you a margin or return, is it? Second, this leads to a if you can't beat them, join them mentality on the part of many utilities. Now, Kentucky, this may not apply, but imagine you're in a blue state like Oregon or California, and you're a utility that's investor-owned, and you have a power plant, coal plant, gas plant, whatever kind of plant, nuclear plant, and you have a power plant that's fully depreciated, you're not earning any profit on it, and the people, activists in a certain community, your state politicians, just hate it. You're being beat up and down the street, all over the place for continuing to operate this power plant, rather than building a new, shiny thing, the technology of the future that everyone appears to want. Why in your right mind, as an investor-owned utility, would you fight that battle? Why not just capitulate and say, oh, dear me, you're going to make me invest more capital to retire a fully depreciated asset and capture those windfall profits? I'd submit to you that's a lot of what we're seeing around the country right now in terms of utility behavior. There's also the phenomenon of gold plating. It's axiomatic in most business that you want to do more with less, right? You want to have less capital investment, less operating expenses, but continue to sell whatever product it is that you make for the same or a greater amount of money, right? That increases your margin, it increases the return to you. Does the investor-owned utility community have that incentive? By and large, no, they do not. They don't want to do more with less. They have a financial incentive. They have a financial incentive to do about the same or slightly more with more and more and more. Again, more capital investment, a greater profit. In fact, the best thing, if you ever really want to know what's going on in the utility industry, don't take it from me, don't take it from consumer advocates, don't take it from the utilities, don't take it from the environmental groups. Go straight to their investors. These are the people, right, who are the honest people in the room who, you know, they have an unconflicted mandate to make money from their investments. And so there was an amazing investor note earlier this year from the bank UBS. And its title very simply was, "More rate base, please." and it proceeded to describe how one of the utilities that it analyzes presented a slideshow to investors. And the slideshow, which I really wish I had a copy of, presented an optimistic case. The utility had been forecasting a few years prior that it would have to spend about $500 million in new metering technology equipment. But in a phenomenon that was described as the upside of the upside, the utility now came in and said it had found a way where it wouldn't have to invest $500 million in the meters, it would have to invest $900 million in the meters. And this was an amazing achievement for this utility. And thus UBS wrote it up saying, "More rate base, please," lauding it and giving it a ratings boost and setting a higher target price for the utility. Entirely on the basis that they had to spend more money to provide the same type of service. This is the thinking of an industry that has come to expect that every dollar of incremental investment will attract the same standard regulated return, regardless of whether it adds more or less or no value to the consumer. Finally, as a perverse incentive, a lack of innovation. And even if you're not, I realize I'm in Kentucky, there's probably a lot of coal guys in the room, but even if you're not a coal guy, you want to be interested in cool new innovations that revolutionize the grid and all that type of thing. You heard about that yesterday. I've heard it all before, so I was not here, but I feel your pain. So even if you want to do something like that, most innovations increase the productivity of capital, increase the productivity of labor. That's the theory right behind innovation, and thus decrease over time the need for investments. So even if you want a utility to behave innovatively with new products, utilities may not do that under the formula that I showed you before, because over the long term it reduces their capital expenditure needs. So we give a lot of businesses, including the utility sector, the benefit of the doubt because they're businesses. And I'm a Republican, and I've heard this all before, that I talk to state legislators in Montana, and they don't pay a lot of attention to utility policy. And they'll tell me, well, I'm a Republican, and that means I'm pro-business, and this utility's a business after all, so QED, where do I sign? where do I sign off on their legislative priorities? That type of thinking badly misapprehends how these firms actually behave. You better believe that a business like Exxon, another person in the energy production business, when faced with an EPA regulation, is going to oppose it hook, line, and sinker, because every added dollar in compliance comes right out of their bottom line. They can't necessarily pass along that cost to consumers like a monopoly can, because they might be competing against a company elsewhere in the world that doesn't have that added cost due to local regulation that's different. Utilities are different. They derive almost entirely, if not entirely, all of their revenue from decisions of government regulators like me. They often boast to their investors that they're 100% regulated. And when they say that, what they mean is that their revenue stream and their profit is insulated from the deleterious effects of things like environmental regulation. If environmental regulation makes them spend more money, that's fine. They can go to their consumers and achieve that. And this phenomenon goes a long way to explaining the type of behavior we saw in litigation patterns around the Clean Power Plan. So really, when you're talking about competition in the utility sector, you're not talking about businesses competing for customers, right? These are monopolies. They have state-granted franchises, and frequently they can't poach their customers. Instead, and this is a key concept that is called rent-seeking, when you have a regulatory system and a heavily regulated industry like this, you're not competing for customers, you're competing for revenue and favors doled out by a regulator. And utilities are creditworthy, they're big vehicles, and there's a growing trend to use them in many, many states instead of the government's balance sheet to achieve policy goals, a phenomenon that a judge named Richard Posner calls taxation by regulation. And so I wrote about this last year in the Wall Street Journal. You can Google it if you like, but it's just one good example where this has occurred. In Oregon, in this particular case. So what did the Greens want in Oregon? This was one of those classic situations where the utility was being really beat up on, and they were like, God, what do I do to get out from under the public hassle that I'm facing? The Greens wanted no coal serving Oregon. There's a lot of coal in Montana, a lot of coal in Wyoming that serves Oregon customers, and a coal plant in Oregon that's closing as well. So the Greens wanted no coal, and they also wanted an expansion of the renewables mandate in Oregon so that it would be 50% of the total power supply would have to come from renewables. The company, seeing the writing on the wall, rather than fighting this, sat down and agreed to a deal. They basically said to the Greens, listen, we will give you everything you want. We will give you the closure of coal, and we will give you 50% renewables. We just have a few little things that we would like from you. First, already, Oregonians have very little choice in the company that serves them. although sometimes rural electric cooperatives can peel off customers from investor-owned utilities in Oregon. This law forbade that, just in case power customers would have second thoughts from their newly clean and green investor-owned utility. So it trapped the customers with the utility. Second, some of the coal plants weren't fully depreciated. So what do? You don't want a stranded asset. You don't want to have all this capital investment hanging out there for coal plants that are now shut down, not delivering anything to consumers. So the law allowed essentially customers to buy the plants out, made them buy out the coal plants in advance, basically accelerating the depreciation. And third, what else did they get? An ability to build those big new things, basically a first option on building the new power plants for a clean and green tomorrow. And that was the deal they cut. And the same deal has been done in many places: Colorado, Nevada, Minnesota, Maryland, California, Washington, and Massachusetts. Obviously, a lot of blue states in that mix, but this has been the work of GOP legislatures in those states too. So now I come to a couple of things that I just want to speak to in terms of remedies. How do you, assuming you agree with me, which you certainly don't have to, how do you try to solve this problem which economists would call a problem of political economy? People who are not necessarily behaving around economic optimality, but are instead infusing the regulatory landscape with political decision-making. All of these remedies have something in common, which is that if we're going to actually talk about these people as businesses, these utilities as businesses, regulation should really make them act like a business and take accountability for the investments they make and make sure that their returns are not above average or politically captured. And I'll just go through each of them briefly. First, investor-owned utilities get paid a shareholder return associated with risk of their investments, and they shouldn't be absolved of that risk. Coal plants are an excellent example. The moment you pay off an investor-owned utility earlier than the upfront expectations of life on an asset, you're essentially absolving that investor, that utility, of the risk of owning that asset. And you're destroying much of the financial incentive to actually keep the power plant running. Again, if you pay off the capital investment, there's no return on the rate base. This has huge implications for coal, and the only way to give the coal industry a fair shot of competing is to ensure that backroom deals don't get done that prevent the utility business from actually behaving like a business. Second, a budget. Revenue requirement regulation, like the type I've spelled out, isn't the best. It's full of perverse incentives, but to some degree that type of regulation is inevitable because a monopoly in certain situations does make sense, sometimes. But if that's the case, then at the very least utilities should be put on a budget tied to something other than regulators' own discretion or whatever utilities happen to have spent in capital in a certain period. Utilities rates should not need to grow more rapidly than other sectors of the economy. It's a mature industry, and ideally rates could be indexed to inflation or GDP growth or subject to some kind of productivity measure. This would do a couple of things. First, it would lead to more innovation to serve customers more cost effectively. And second, perhaps even more importantly, the reform would also prevent utilities from being so easily co-opted by interest groups who essentially do the type of deal that I described happened in Oregon. And finally, this is a bit of advice to all the legislators in the room. Regulators, legislators, policymakers in general shouldn't be confused. The parties that appear before you are not typically the public, and the interests of the stakeholders together does not necessarily constitute the public interest. I've now been a public service commissioner for nearly 7 years, and I can tell you the decisions I make have the greatest impact on low and fixed income people who live in my state and in my district where I'm elected from. But how often do those people actually show up to my commission proceedings? And if they do show up, can they really understand the details and complexities of what's happening? Do they really have the same type of bargaining seat at the table as do the moneyed interest groups? Some of the money interest groups purport even to represent them, but you can notice some subtle differences. Basically, regulators and policymakers need to keep in mind that compromises between stakeholder groups are often just that. They're compromises between those interest groups, not compromises that are in the public's interest. So I would urge you, that's why you're all elected, not to try to negotiate and put people into a kind of log rolling situation. People are elected like me, like legislators, they're appointed like the public service commissioners in these states, not necessarily to mediate those disputes, but to regulate in the public interest, which is a similar but different thing. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It's adapted from a much, much longer essay, which if you ever have a couple spare hours, I would encourage you to read if you find this type of thing interesting. It was published in American Affairs, and I'd be happy to take your questions, should you have any. Thank you for having me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. I don't, the question is, the comment was utilities aren't the bad guys here. They're not the devil, to quote Charles. I agree with that. And they didn't create the revenue requirements formula. It's usually enacted in statute or by regulation, and is it wrong? I'll answer that in a couple of ways. First, to your point about how did this kind of come to be? What's the history of the revenue requirement? And this is a topic I explore more fully in this essay. The utility sector from the very beginning, and very unlike a lot of other sectors of business, clamored to be regulated. And you can go back to Thomas Edison. This is actually being made into a motion picture. If anyone's seen the feature film that's going to be The Battle of the Currents, I guess I lack imagination because I didn't realize this was exciting enough to be a major motion picture, but stay tuned. But the basic history is Edison and Westinghouse had a war with competing currents. You had just a bonanza of electric utilities with wires streaming all over the places in places like New York, Chicago. It was dangerous, and in order to consolidate the industry for the sake of safety, a couple of big utilities led by Edison and his sort of trainee disciple Samuel Insull lobbied successfully state legislatures all over the country to grant them a monopoly franchise. And the basic bargain was struck there where I get a monopoly over a certain area in exchange for you, the government's power to regulate rates. Now, how do you regulate the rates of a monopoly? Well, there's all sorts of different ways to try to decide what a monopoly's prices should be, but over time we've come to realize that those prices of a monopoly should really just be set on the basis of cost. Whatever it is that you prudently or reasonably spent providing service to customers should be reflected in your prices, no more and no less. And so that's ultimately the core of the discretionary problem that gets you to the revenue requirements thing that I've laid out. My biggest remedy that I would propose is that you should let them generally recover what a service costs through its prices, but you should be sensitive to the fact that utility rates, in my view, should not need to grow at a higher pace than CPI or GDP, less some kind of measure of productivity. I mean, and this goes to my point. This is a mature industry, and it shouldn't need substantial capital reinvestment frequently in excess of its depreciation that it already gets in rates. So my advice to regulators or legislators, if this is a statutory issue, would be to think of adopting a hybrid approach where you can realize that cost forms the basis of price, but you try to keep in mind what, say, every senior who's living on Social Security has to keep in mind, which is that it's somehow chained to inflation or some other index. It's not, the reason why we have 50 states is for experiments like this to be conducted. Someone should raise their hand and try to do that type of regulation, in my view. It would do a lot to put the brakes on the perverse incentives that I've called out here. And if your utilities, as I mentioned, Kentucky Utilities was actually one of the 7 that signed on and litigated the Clean Power Plan in its own name. So I'm not picking on them, but they're at this point almost the exception to the rule of the rest of the electric utility industry in this country. Sure. Yes, I think there is, there can be that kind of incentive. The question was, is there a way to incent utilities to want to continue to utilize assets that have reached the end of their useful life per the books, per that revenue requirement formula? I think there is, and I won't go into all of the mundane details, but if you focus on the sort of net power costs and think about benchmarking a return to the total sum of money it costs you not only to own, but also to operate power plants, and somehow base a kind of floating return on that, where you pay less you ratchet down the return on newly capitalized assets, but you pay perhaps a bit of a margin if continued operation of productive assets results in lower net costs. That's a way to get you there. It's complicated, but going in that direction would to some degree fix the incentive problem that utilities have to build shiny new things and close down old things, even though the latter may be still productive. That was very technical, and I apologize for that. Any other questions? Well, I hope this has been interesting for you. I realize that beginning a morning with the regulation of utilities can be a tad hazardous, so I'm sure you all need another cup of coffee after this, but I'll stick around through the morning, and if you have a question for me that you didn't quite feel prepared to ask in here, I'd be happy to meet you out in the hallway. Thank you very much.